Today is Steve Budd from Brotherhood Mutual. He is going to talk about threats to ministry. They're continually changing, so churches need insurance partners who are staying abreast of these dangers by developing new proactive insurance and risk management plans that allow churches to think less about guarding their ministry and more about fulfilling it. Let's give them a welcome. And no rotten fruit.
I'll bet you say that to all the insurance guys. It's like, this time of day, it's like time not off, and this is insurance. So it's not very interesting. Do I need the mic?
No.
Oh, you're pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, we're good. So my name is Steve Budd. I'm with American Church Group of Minnesota. I'm an independent insurance agent, and the company we work with is Brotherhood Mutual. And I'll just run through the little advertising here. We're a Christian-based insurance agency. We have over 6,000 ministries across 9 states, including 900 in Minnesota and quite a few actually in the Bemidji area. We have 60 people supporting our team, so when you need service, you've got it. We all attend a local church in order to represent Brotherhood Mutual. They ask that we give our testimony, which is what we do to their board, and then they'll give their blessing that we can represent them. We are Brotherhood Mutual's largest agency in the United States, and they have over 60,000 ministries nationwide and more top 100 in churches, more top 100 ministries than any other insurance carrier. And you can't really see this at the bottom. If you want to get a flavor for Brotherhood Mutual, you can look at the bottom of your declaration page. It's Galatians 6:2. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. That gives you a flavor for the company and who they serve and how they serve. So we just start at the top. Why do you need insurance protection? And I usually say there's 2 reasons. One is the nature of nature. Ever since Genesis and the curse, things happen. There is hail, there is wind. I understand Bemidji's had some pretty decent straight line winds in the last few years. One commentator said about the curse, he said it's a divine sanction imposed for covenantal treason. So that's what we're living with, and that's why we need insurance. The other reason is the nature of man. And even when man is not desperately wicked and acting out as such, he can be forgetful, or he can be stupid, or any number of other things. People say, why do you believe? Do you believe the Bible's true? Why do you believe the Bible? And I know there's a lot of good reasons, internal, external, all of those things. For me, this really cuts to the chase, because everything the Bible says about the nature of man, cover to cover, is observably true, isn't it? And we see it all the time. So you need insurance protection because of the nature of nature and the nature of man. What do you need to protect? The 2 obvious things are people and property, and any insurance company is going to offer you protection for your people and your property. But there's a couple other things that are really important. The other one is reputation. One of the coverages we have within our sexual misconduct form is image restoration. So when you have an allegation against your ministry, the reputation can be the most hurtful part of that, even if it's a frivolous allegation. So you want to make sure your insurance carrier is going to help you, rather than maybe settling very quickly so that the amount you settle for is as small as possible. Maybe take a little bit longer so that you make sure you're maintaining your reputation throughout the whole thing. And then lastly, the mission. I mean, a claim, an allegation of sexual misconduct can not only hurt your reputation, but it can derail your mission. You're thinking nothing about this lawsuit that's in front of you instead of what God's called you to do. So you think about what insurance policies you need. The first one is property liability. It's called a package or commercial multi-peril. Probably everyone in the room, your ministry has this. It covers your property, your liability. It's all one package. You may need an excess umbrella, and people ask me, do I need an umbrella? Well, an umbrella is a liability policy. It's an additional $1 million or more over top of your underlying property liability coverages. And people ask me if they need it, and I will usually say, I hope you never do, and I don't know if you will. But you need to think about a number of things before you say you don't want to buy an umbrella. One is, do you do a lot of driving or are you active? If you're doing a lot of driving, even if it's not ministry-owned vehicles, if it's volunteers driving, you should still think about an umbrella. If you're a camp or a school, definitely an umbrella, because that's going to give you some additional protection over and above your underlying coverages. The other thing is, what do you have to lose in the way of assets? If you're a mega church, you might have an $80 million building you could lose in a lawsuit. You definitely need an umbrella. We can talk about how much you need, but that's additional liability protection in case you're sued. Workers' comp. Here's one I get all the time. So I've covered the state of Minnesota for about 11 years. Pastor is an independent contractor, and therefore we don't need to buy workers' comp insurance for him. That's what I hear. And the state of Minnesota would differ with you on that. There are really two reasons you need workers' comp. One is humanitarian and one is legal. The legal reasons are, the state of Minnesota says, if you as an organization are providing a place for someone to work, if you are providing equipment for them to work, if you have pretty good control over their schedule, in other words, Pastor, you have to preach on Sunday, if they report to a board, for workers' comp purposes, they are an employee and you need to buy workers' comp insurance for them. The humanitarian reason, I think, is probably even more compelling. Imagine if you're if you could cancel that, that'd be great. Thanks, sorry about that. Imagine if you're preaching on a Sunday morning, you step off the pulpit and you're injured. You go to the hospital and before they say, how are you, they say, where did this happen? And they do that because they want to know which insurance pile to put it in. And if you say, oh, well, it's happened at church. What were you doing? Well, I was preaching, I was a pastor. Oh, this goes in the workers' comp pile because your health carrier probably wouldn't pay for that because it's a workers' comp injury, it happened on the job. And if you don't have workers' comp insurance, your church, your ministry could end up paying the workers' comp or medical bills for years and years to come. And the state might even fine you. So workers' comp is great insurance. It's first in line over any other insurance. No deductibles, no co-pays. I mean, it is the best insurance there is. So if you don't have workers' comp for your pastor, think about the legal and humanitarian reasons for doing that. Vehicle, obviously if you have a vehicle, you need insurance for those vehicles. If you charter a scout troop and they have a trailer on your property, that trailer does not belong to the scouts because they don't own property. All of the property that looks like it belongs to the scouts belongs to the church. So you need to have all their property and their trailer covered on a vehicle policy. Foreign travel. Insurance policies are written with the policy territory being the United States, Canada, Puerto Rico, and U.S. territories. Outside of that, you have no coverage. So if you're going to Mexico, you need to think about some additional foreign travel insurance. And then flood. Flood isn't an automatic on policies. Lastly is student and camper accident. Insurance companies look at schools and at camps differently than they look at churches. And they say if you've got campers or students enrolled in your school or in your camp, well, the exposure for the insurance company is greater because they're going to be there a longer period of time versus coming into church on a Sunday morning and then leaving. So they exclude campers and students from their medical coverage. So you need to make sure you can get that added back in real easy. But you need to make sure you're asking the question, do we have student medical? Do we need student medical? Something we want to think about. So these are kind of the different policies you really should have most of those. Anybody got any questions? I mean, I don't want to just ramble here. If anybody...
That image restoration, what would you guys provide and what's that about?
Yeah, so we had a church. I don't know why this always happens. There's churches in northern Minnesota that this happens, but we had a church in northern Minnesota where there was an allegation of sexual misconduct, and it was frivolous. Everybody knew it was frivolous. The church did, the community did, certainly the pastor did. It was against the pastor. Everybody knew it was a frivolous allegation, so it was just dismissed out of hand. However, we ended up paying, and I think it was about a $10,000 payment by the time it was done, for image restoration, just to say, okay, there was nothing to this claim, and because there was nothing to it, we're completely innocent, no negligence, nothing like that. Nevertheless, it's out in the community, and the community hears about the claim. They know, oh, XYZ Church has had a claim, now it's all around the community. You need some kind of help in helping with the image restoration or restoring your reputation after something like that.
And what would you do with those funds? What would you do with the funds?
Is that media coverage?
Yeah, it's really media coverage, PR and things like
Okay.
that. So if it's dealing with the media, it's okay, what kind of a public statement would we put out that says, you may have heard there were allegations, let us explain to you what happened. There were allegations, there were false allegations, there was no negligence. Here's what we do to protect people in our church, and listing things like that. So, I mean, it was I don't know actually what all it involved, but it was
So it's to get the PR out, to get the word out that.
Yep.
Okay, I see. To
Yep.
kind of combat the rumors.
Yeah, because once the rumor's out, I mean, that's,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for asking.
Just one of the questions. If you didn't have workman's comp, but you had the umbrella liability, could the liability cover the workman's comp claim if you had one?
So the way workers' comp, actually it would, if you had workers' comp, it would go over top of your workers' comp, but if you don't have workers' comp, you wouldn't have the umbrella.
Yeah, or
You would not have the protection of the umbrella for workers'
for
comp.
workers' comp, but they could sue you. Couldn't that person sue the church and then get it under the umbrella?
If they sued the church, yeah, exactly. That's what would happen. So the thing about it, if you have sometimes we even get into discussions about what pastors do. I mean, if you're in a small church, you're a pastor in a small church, and you've got a job description that says you're going to preach on Sunday morning and all the other things you have to do, and you're not mowing the grass, or I had one pastor who was doing electrical work in the church. Well, is that part of the pastor's job description? If they're injured doing that, does workers' comp apply to them? That could be that could be an iffy situation, but if it didn't, they would have their med pay and then general liability if there's negligence. But the state of Minnesota could go back and say, well, by law, you should have workers' comp insurance.
I can give a testimony for you with that. You can't really tell if this finger is broken, but this finger was broken. In fact, the surgeon said it would never be any more straight than this, but God is... But anyway, what happened was I went to the hospital with the bone protruding, and the hospital said, how did this happen? And I said, well, I got hit straight on with a softball that busted the finger. And that's really, what were you doing? I said, well, my church softball team is playing in the Camp Chaminade softball tournament out here in Big Lake, and was with the church, and what are you? I'm the pastor. Oh, well, so you were there because it's your job? We should file this with workers' comp. And I said, workers' comp? And so they sent it in, and not only did the workers' comp cover a softball injury, you know, how is that in a pastor's job description? But it was at a Bible camp fundraiser, and I was there as the pastor, and so on. But then I didn't miss any preaching. I mean, you know, workers' comp kept hounding me for how much salary loss did I have that they should pay for. And I said, no, I didn't lose any salary. Well, you must have. You were in the hospital for a day. So they wanted to pay me what I wasn't even asking for.
So yeah, thanks for that word of testimony. That's actually a really good example, because they do press you for where and how did this happen. We just paid one that's absolutely tragic, a pastor doing activities like that who died. And so there's payments to spouses. I mean, if you're a pastor and you're driving around making calls and you're in an accident or something like that, and the Lord takes you home, how are you going to provide for your family and workers? That's part of workers' comp too. It's really, yeah, I can't. And that's why camps in particular have a difficult time with workers' comp. So if you have a whole lot of workers' comp claims, you'll have an experience mod. An experience mod will drive your premium up. And the reason camps many times have a lot of workers' comp claims is because many times the people who are supposed to be overseeing the activities don't understand what oversight means versus being involved in. And they're employees and they get injured.
A question for you. If it's too many details and I take too long to explain it, just let me know and I can approach you later. But a couple things I'm putting together. When you said volunteers at camp, when volunteers are at camp, many, I want to paint two pictures. One side, you have volunteers who are veterans who have the VA or retired military, and then you also have personnel who are volunteering but don't have anything in their background at all as far as healthcare or anything else to fall back on. And on that side of it, in that question, I've also from what you're telling us, putting together the fact of reputation as well. So if somebody does something at camp and they either have or have not anything in the background for depending upon medical care, and also if whatever it is the situation is that creates a problem for the reputation, directly specifically to the volunteer, but as it would spread to the ministry, and we know how false allegations run wild, what are you suggesting that under one umbrella insurance policy or whatever it may be called, workers' compensation, that in one case, one set of volunteers would be covered, another set of volunteers may not be covered, and also how do we protect the reputation? You mentioned of the ministry, but also how do you protect the reputation of the volunteers, and also how do we protect the volunteers coming from what he was saying, how to avoid being a liability to the ministry because of our background. Trust me, there's a lot of issues associated with being a veteran that comes with a liability, especially in this hypersensitive day and age. How can we protect the ministry that we work with in that reputation situation when in fact it was all false to begin with?
Well, so there's a number of different things going on in
Yes.
what you were saying.
Yes.
The workers' comp is one thing. That's for people you are paying. It's for employees. So you use the word volunteers.
Yes.
Workers' comp would not apply to volunteers.
It does or does not?
It does not.
Okay.
The workers' comp is for paid employees, so it's
Okay.
statute by law. You have to buy workers' comp for people who are employed. Volunteers have coverage. They would be covered with what's called med pay. Med pay is just somebody slips and falls and you need to get them to the hospital and you say, we'll turn this into our insurance company. We have insurance that will help you with your medical bills. That's what med pay is. It's goodwill. If you go into a large retailer, for example, you slip and fall, they don't have med pay. If you want money from them, you'll have to sue them to get the money. But you're a ministry, you want to offer a little bit of goodwill, and that's really what MedPay provides.
What level is that med pay at? Is it like 5 or 10?
That's a good, oh, you're experienced in this.
No.
It sounds like you are. 5 or 10 is usually what we see. I have been getting ministries going to a lower amount to save a little bit of money and to help with claims. So 10 has kind of been around for quite a while, and in the last few years, we've been going to 5. If you think about what it is, it's goodwill. How much do you want to pay for goodwill? You've got $5,000 med pay to help somebody with their medical bills. Let's say somebody slips and falls. You say, we're going to help you with your medical bills, we'll send this into our insurance company. And then a week later, you get a call or a letter that says, I'm so-and-so attorney, and I represent so-and-so who slipped and fell in your parking lot. The insurance company would no longer view that as a med pay claim. They would move that into liability, for which you probably have $1 million at least, plus your umbrella. So med pay is just, it's really just goodwill, is what it is.
Let's say you have a $5,000 med pay policy. Is that $5,000 limit for the year?
No, it's per occurrence, however many occurrences you have. Right. The liability would be, normally we write with $1 million liability and a $3 million aggregate. That just means you can have $3 million claims in a year, but for larger ministries, it's a little different.
But your umbrella is above and beyond that. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. Yep. I'll catch you in a second. I got to get back to your. So that's what you'd have for volunteers. They would have med pay, and then if there was negligence and they sued you, you would have your liability for that, but you really wouldn't have workers' comp. The other question you had, I think, had to do with allegations and false allegations. And insurance companies treat this a little bit differently. The company I represent, Brotherhood, if there's an allegation against you of sexual misconduct, not only do they represent the ministry, the church, or the camp, we will also represent the alleged perpetrator up until the time they're proven guilty or admit to guilt. And we do that because there are quite a few false allegations, and you don't want to send your pastor out to get his own attorney, his or her own attorney, if there's an allegation that everybody knows is false. But up until the time they're proven guilty or admit to guilt, then they would be represented, at least with Brotherhood.
So I work here, it's all part of the same organization, but there are a few of us that are full-time staff there that raise our own support. But do we fall under the employee category then?
Yeah.
So like workers' comp, we're raising our own supports, and we're being paid through the organization out of what we raise. But do we fall under that category of employees?
Employee, yeah, you definitely wouldn't be a volunteer, but you would be an employee. So the way workers' comp works, I don't want to get too complicated, but you pay your workers' comp premiums based on what you think your payroll is going to be for the coming year. So that you pay that, and then at the end of the year you do an audit. If you overpay, you get money back. If you underpay, then there'll be a premium due, but it's kind of based on what you think it's going to be. But you would be an employee. Yeah. All right, we'll move on. So what should you expect from us? I'm your agent. We work with Brotherhood Mutual as a carrier. The first thing you ought to expect is a premium. You all know that, right? Isn't it funny? Insurance companies, I don't know why they do this. They call it a premium, and you think, wow, I'm going to get something really, really nice. What you get is a bill. It's a premium. But usually there are 4 things that affect premiums. I'll get a call from a church, and they'll say, why did my premium go up? And there are a number of things. The first thing is claims. If you've had claims, that's going to affect your premium. If it's been really bad and you've got a lot of claims, it could affect your insurability, and that's someplace you don't want to be, because then to get insurance in a different market would cost you an arm and a leg. So claims, that's why risk management's important. It helps keep your premium down. Coverages change from time to time, or they should. I would hope the insurance coverages you had 10 years ago are not the same ones you have today. We weren't giving a thought to cyber liability 10 years ago, and now all of a sudden cyber liability is a big deal. Theft by coercion or electronic commerce, you've probably had this happen in your ministry. Somebody calls and says, hey, this is Pastor, or sends an email, this is Pastor, I need money, would you send me money? Oh yeah, I'll make sure you get the money, and it ends up being not Pastor. So those kinds of things, coercion, theft by electronic commerce. So as coverages get enhanced or get added, those can affect your premiums. Insurance companies will reprice their coverages from time to time. I know with Brotherhood, when we first introduced cyber, it was You could get $1 million for like $15 a year, and now it's about 10 times that, just because they've had a lot of claims. So that can affect your premium. The other is replacement cost value. If you have the same replacement cost on your property today that you had 10 years ago, more than likely you're going to be way, way underinsured. So you want the insurance company to stay up with what it costs to replace your buildings with like, kind, and quality material today in the zip code. And the insurance companies do that, or they should be doing that. We do that every year. If your building's $1 million building and next year it's a $1.2 million building, it costs more to insure 1.2 than it does $1 million, so that can increase your premium. The other is rates. As insurance companies have bad loss experiences in a state, they can increase their rates, and welcome to Minnesota. We've been trying to hold Brotherhood Mutual off for a number of years, and last year they said, no, we got to take a bit of a rate increase in Minnesota, and just like everybody else has. So it's hail, it's wind, it's all of those things. But those are the main drivers of, and usually when there's an increase in a premium, it's usually a combination of all of those.
Just a comment. See, we were talking in an earlier session about rural realities. My observation is that if your trustees or the decision-making board in your church are older people, they will underestimate typically replacement costs based not only on being out of touch a bit with materials, but out of touch in a significant way with labor. And that we didn't have any issues in my church experience, but we had a lot of volunteers, a lot of older gentlemen that were involved, and some of them probably couldn't have conceived of hiring a carpenter for more than $15 an hour, you know, et cetera. So just revisiting that conversation, agree with what you said, that needs to be revisited from time to time.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up, and it's a really important question. People will tell me, if we had to sell our church, we couldn't sell it for $2 million. We'd be lucky to get $1 million for it. Well, that may be if you had to sell it, but what we're providing, what the insurance company provides, is not a market valuation. We provide a replacement cost valuation with like, kind, and quality. We work with a company called Marshall & Swift. They're a professional appraisal company, and you should make sure your insurance company does that. The square footage, the building type, quality construction, all of those things factor into it. Market value really has nothing to do with it. And you're exactly right. I get this all the time from churches. Oh, if we had to replace this building, it wouldn't cost us $2 million. Let's see, you've got stained glass, you've got a pipe organ, you've got pews, all of those things factor into the cost of the building. We can have that discussion, but thanks, Pastor, for saying that, because it's a really good point.
So, just for clarification, when you say market value, is that like that piece of paper that you get in the mail that says that your taxes are going to be so much based on the community standard? Is that what you refer by?
Yeah, that's not what we do.
Correct. Okay, so it's not that. It's
Correct.
just replacement. Okay.
Yep, and your insurance agent should be able to do that for you. And if you have questions, I mean, we get into detail with people all the time. They say, you know, that seems like a whole lot. And I'll back up and I'll say, you've got 13,000 square feet. Your replacement cost per square foot is calculated at about $150 to $180. That's maybe a tad bit on the low end, but if you don't have a lot of built-ins, pipe organ, stained glass, those kinds of things, or basement, you're probably pretty good. So don't be afraid to have that discussion with your insurance agent. Something else you should expect is customized coverages and limits for your ministry. I was on the board of my church for 16 years, and I completely understand when the plate gets passed on Sunday morning, if that money's going to insurance and operational costs instead of the mission and reaching the lost, then it's not a good thing. So I completely understand that you have to balance how much risk are you going to take on and how much do you want to push off to the insurance company. So everything's different for every ministry. Buildings, we just had a discussion about buildings. Make sure your buildings are valued correctly. Contents, 900 ministries in Minnesota, I think they have 1 or 2 that know the value of their contents. And they know that because they just had a total loss and they had to replace everything. Most churches don't know. We would suggest getting a good building valuation and looking at your contents as a percentage of the building valuation. If your contents are 10%, you're probably on the low side. If they're 20% of the building value, they're probably toward the higher side, but at least you'd be safer. That's, we found with claims that come in, that's a pretty good way to benchmark what you should have for contents. 10% on the low side, 20% of the building on the high side.
What do you see for deductibles on building for damage?
Yeah, and again, that's one of the things about customizing your coverage. How much risk do you want to take on and how much do you want to get on the insurance company? Well, one of the ways you take on risk is a deductible. For a long time we saw $1,000 and now ministries are saying, or trustees are saying, I have a bigger deductible than that on my house, and it would not be a hardship for the church to have a $2,500 or even a $5,000 deductible. Obviously your deductibles are higher, you save money, that's more money for ministry. So I would urge you, if you've got a $1,000 deductible, or some even have less, just see how much it would cost to go to a higher deductible. For some churches, more than $1,000 might be a hardship. I completely understand that. But for other churches, you know, when something goes wrong or you have a claim, they can raise money fairly quickly, and $2,500 or $5,000 wouldn't be out of the question. So 1,000 is kind of what we see, but we're also seeing people moving higher deductibles. Equipment is your equipment covered. Boilers, furnace, mechanical, if you have a sudden accidental breakdown. Financial assets, this is part of the property you own. At a church, before they were with us, they had a claim, and the pastor I was talking to explained that their former pastor had embezzled $70,000 over a 5-year period. It was kind of the church's fault, right? They had no checks and balances in place. The pastor wrote the checks, the pastor counted the offering, the pastor did all of this stuff. I can't think of a pastor who would want to do that, first of all, but that's what this pastor did, and ended up embezzling $70,000 over a 5-year period. They had a limit on their old policy of $10,000. They went with a higher limit when we wrote them, and they'll probably never need it, but that's why it's important to have controls in place for financial assets, because we get it with credit cards. You've got a volunteer who's working in your ministry and he says, yeah, I'll take the Sam's Club card and I'll go to Sam's Club and buy stuff for the church, and they pick up stuff for the church and a few things for themselves, and after a while we had one that ended up being $10,000 that they had bought for themselves, and of course they always intended to pay it back. But those are your financial assets.
Does Brotherhood Mutual either recommend or require that the folks managing the money, for instance, the church treasurer or things like that, be bonded or not?
That's actually what this is. This is the one thing different about Brotherhood Mutual. So your place of employment, it would be called employee dishonesty. The form with Brotherhood is ministry personnel dishonesty, so it covers you for volunteer theft also. And if you wanted more than $50,000, we'd ask a few more questions about how often the accounts are reconciled. Do you have 2 people counting the money, and you know, those kinds of things. And then a few more questions if you wanted $500,000 or more. We have some that have that high. The last one is one that I don't think people think that much about, and that's extra expense loss of earnings. What are you going to do if something happens, if you have a fire? What are you going to do to keep the ministry going, and what's it going to cost you? Good example, I had a camp that had right before camp was supposed to open, they had a building collapse. And they had to decide, are we going to keep the camp going? And if we do, how much is that going to cost us? Because this wasn't just a cabin, this was a fairly significant, I think it was a chapel. What's it going to cost us? What are we going to have to do? Or if we shut down camp, how much are we gonna lose in revenue because we got all this tuition being paid, and now we're not gonna have this. And it happens with churches that have schools or that have larger groups using their building all the time. That's what extra expense and loss of earnings is intended to do. And I review the amounts on this all the time with people, because we see claims come in where a church is out of the building for a year. They have to meet in a community center or a school, and schools have become very expensive. Or we see it with camps. What do you stand to lose if you're out of your camp for 6 months during the main season? How much are you going to stand to lose? Well, there's an insurance coverage that covers that, and we look at that pretty carefully because it's really important. So it's a property coverage. On the liability side, we talked about sexual misconduct. Brotherhood Mutual used to get, I was talking to an attorney last week, and she said they get about 1 claim a week on sexual misconduct. In the last year or so, it's been like 7 or 8.
How many churches are you guys involved, are they involved with?
Brotherhood Mutual has 60,000
Oh,
across the United States, so yeah. Yeah, for us, I think we've probably got, well, we may have 4 or 5 on the books right now. They didn't come in all at
and
once.
you're about 900 churches.
Yeah, in Minnesota. I think the Me Too movement has created some awareness, and people are just, that's what they're doing. And of those, I think a fairly small percentage are actually valid claims, but nevertheless, you turn them over to your insurance company. We have a duty to defend you, and that's what we do, and that's part of the...
Are there generally deductibles on the liability?
It depends on the insurance company. Brotherhood Mutual has no deductible, 0, on any of their liability coverages, and that's a bit unusual. Most insurance companies that I've seen have deductibles on their employment practices liability and their directors and officers. Not on these. So if you have and the sexual misconduct limit we usually see for a church is probably $300,000. That's been sufficient. Keeping in mind that the insurance company pays all the attorney's fees. So your attorney's fees do not come out of that, whatever that sexual misconduct limit is.
Just thinking, anecdotal illustration that I wouldn't have thought of a few years ago. A large church in the Midwest that ran a very large preschool program had an allegation of sexual misconduct from a preschooler, and they immediately shut down the building. But because they were a large church, they had closed circuit cameras in every conceivable area, and the little girl was lying. And so I don't know what the insurance implications were, but the reason I gave the anecdote at this point is it's not just the Me Too or the adult potential manipulation on the false allegation side. This was a little person who had heard the language and used it. She understood what words to say to create a reaction, and she got a reaction, which could have been very, very serious. It turned out it was just a little childhood discipline, but this is no longer something beyond conceiving, even for churches that are very meticulous about what they do.
Yeah, and just like with financial controls, when you have multiple people involved in counting money and things like that, it's not just for the protection of the church, it's for the protection of the people who are serving. I have a large church in the Twin Cities where that scenario actually played out. They went back and replayed the cameras. It was an allegation against one of the workers. The worker wasn't even there that day, and they could show on the camera the worker wasn't there. So, yeah, it's a great point.
But then that also gets into the whole area that you just talked about, not only the restoration of reputation and so on, but the loss of earning. It can affect the Sunday morning offerings. Is there insurance that covers that, or does that?
Not on the liability side. That's why the reputation or the image restoration is really important, because you want people to understand in a factual way what went on and what the church is doing to address it. I had a church in the cities a number of years ago that I was interviewing, and the lady was just frustrated. She said there was a situation here where a female adult teacher molested a male student, and they sent her up the river. I mean, this was really serious. And they went through and did all the things you needed to do. Not just background checks. That background checks is not only gonna catch things, it's a whole lot of other things. And she said, this is the safest place you could send your kids, I guarantee you, and people don't wanna come here because of that one incident.
A couple of years ago, we had a presentation given by law enforcement officer regarding cybersecurity. And I asked him a question, and he was talking about all the procedures and policies and stuff of that nature. And towards the very end of that explanation, I asked him a question. I said, okay, so, and I bring this up because in the previous regarding youth and mental health, this was also brought up regarding pornographic images coming up on cell phones, laptops. You didn't ask for it, don't want it, but it's just there because it's some, through the cybersecurity process, certain people have been able to bypass that. And I asked them the question, I said, if a person ends up with an image of an underage on their phone, didn't want it, didn't expect it, didn't ask for it, it just happened to be there, how is it that we are sending the person who owns that phone as a victim, how is it that we're sending them to jail for being a subject? And
What do you say?
unfortunately, he said, that's a good question. And he said that 3 times through the presentation. So I know he was processing that the whole time. But there was really honestly no answer given.
Well, just so you know, I mean, the way insurance works is if, and I think all companies are pretty much the same, you've got an insurance policy that covers the ministry, the church, the camp, the school, but it also covers appointed leaders, so people you appoint. So there would be some kind of coverage and certainly legal representation if something like that happened. The other thing that's hard, I think, can be so gray sometimes, and that's mandatory reporting. I mean, you're a mandatory reporter, you have to report what happens if you don't, and you can get in serious, serious trouble. So a whole lot of things around this. The other one that's big, and somebody asked me about it earlier, is registered sex offenders. You know, this is not a, I got 5 minutes left. I'm going to race through some of these. I do want to talk about the sex offender because I get that question, and this is not just a big city question. This is I get questions in the Iron Range, I get questions all over the place. We've got a registered sex offender that wants to come to our church. Would love to say no, but I want to give him the chance. You know, we're in the redemption business. It's not like we're just an organization that can say, you can't come here anymore. You can certainly do that if you want, and you may have to, but we're in the redemption business. And many times we found that, first of all, we said, go to your board and make sure that this person understands. If they come back to your church, there are certain things they have to do. There are certain boundaries. There are places they can never go. They have to be with somebody all the time. Even outside activities, there are certain activities they can't go to. They can't go to restrooms, those kinds of things. Most of the time what we've seen is if you tell somebody that and say, I completely get it, I'm so sorry, I understand it, I'll abide by whatever you say, it's really a pretty good indication the Lord's turning their heart. You know, you can never know for sure. And then the other piece is protecting your flock. How much information do you tell to people?
3 minutes. That's how much information. 3 minutes.
Okay. We can have an extended discussion on that if you want, but you do have the right legally to tell somebody they can't come back into your building. I had a situation on the Iron Range where the pastor told the guy, you cannot come back until we talk to you and interview you. That was really, really wise counsel. He did the right thing. The guy shows up with his wife on a Sunday morning, and the pastor said, you can't come back here. We were going to talk to you before you could come back. And the guy said, no, I just thought I'd come back. They had him removed from the property, and they said, you cannot come back on the property but we will minister to you. I've got a coalition of 2 or 3 pastors in the area. We're going to get together with you off-site, and this is how we're going to minister to you. I thought that was a really wise thing for the pastor.
He was okay with that.
I don't get the feeling that he was, actually. No, I don't get the impression the guy was. I think it was a power thing, that he was going to get back into that church no matter what. I'm going to run through these. This is a big one, religious freedom. If you have a policy, a few years ago, the Supreme Court came out with a decision on marriage. It was there's a religious carve-out. So religious institutions are still kind of a gray area on what they can do. They didn't really address it. So if you have a policy on, somebody comes to this church or Oak Hills, for example, and they're homosexuals who want to get married, do you have a policy on that? And if you do, and you tell somebody they can't be married there, you may open yourself up to a lawsuit. So do you have insurance protection for that? Do you have insurance protection if the government gets involved and tries to have your tax exempt status removed because of a religious practice? Those kinds of things you need to think. 10 years ago, who would have thought of this? Directors and officers, not a lot of D&O suits, but we do have one right now. It's actually a Christian school. A lady died, left a lot of money to a Christian school, and the Christian school was happy to take that money. Everything was legal. She had the will and everything else, and then the lawsuit came. The kids of the lady came back and said, you coerced our mother into giving to this Christian school, therefore we're suing you. And D&O attorneys are not $100 an hour. They're really pricey. So you really should think about that. Hired a non-owned vehicle, I gotta get going. Cyber. Media and communication, how you communicate. Do you have coverages if you hurt somebody's feelings? Do you have coverage for Twitter, Facebook, website? Do you have email prayer chains that you send prayer requests out that have too much information, or maybe you're not watching the distribution lists and they're going to somebody who has left the ministry in a huff? You could open yourself up. Counseling, I think we talked about that. Hiring and firing. This is getting big in Minnesota, and people say Minnesota is an at-will state, therefore I don't have to worry about employment practices liability. I've got a 6-figure lawsuit settlement, actually, that says you do. This is for hiring and firing, employment practices. Traumatic incident response and security operations. Those two are kind of related, and I've got descriptions out on the table there if you want to grab those. The traumatic incident has to do with if you have a shooting in your church, for example, or any other traumatic incident, and the lawsuits would be, you didn't do what you could do to protect me when I was in your church. Security operations is a unique coverage. Brotherhood Mutual is the only company I know of that has this. It covers people who are on your safety team individually. It increases their med pay to $50,000. It gives them coverage for personal property up to $10,000, and it covers them if they shoot somebody. There's a description of that out on the table you can pick up. I'm going to get through the rest of this junk. We talked about some of it. One of the things I find all the time, people many times try to reinvent the wheel instead of calling their insurance agent or going on the insurance company's website looking for resources. I mean, you can get publications and articles at brotherhoodmutual.com or any other insurance company probably, instead of trying to look somewhere else. We've got on-demand webinars, online training, legal assistance. We'll review your contracts, we'll review your bylaws, doesn't cost you anything. I know we have a vested interest in it, but any legal assist, we'd be happy to do that. We do payroll now because that's become a risk. It's a risk you're offloading onto the insurance company to do your payroll just because of clergy housing allowances, and I understand the recent lawsuit came out in favor of clergy on that one though, which is great. I hate to skip through this, but Tim's going to be in it, he's going to. These are the things that the questions our company gets, and they kind of rank this. So last year, number 12 was developing worker screening policies. That's one of the most popular things that people were inquiring about. The year before, it was number 14. Bylaws, independent contractors. Child immunization was number 9 this year. Last year was number 20, so there's questions about preschools and that, about immunization of children. I don't know why that's there. Activity participation agreement. Lending church facilities. Last year it was number 2, this year it's number 6. A lot of questions about lending church facilities. Grab me if you have questions. We've got a sample facility use agreement out on the table there that you can look at, or you can actually take. When people use your facilities, they should provide you a certificate of insurance. They need to have some skin in the game. Churches are so nice. They let people use their buildings. Many times they're doing it for nothing. The least other people can do is provide a certificate of insurance, or at least to release the liability. Fair Labor Standards Act, church board member liability. The last 2 both have to do with security. Armed security was number 1 last year, and it's number 1 this year, or 2018. Questions about armed security. Can we have armed security? And there's a pamphlet out there that I think there's a few left on having armed security. Just so you know, Brotherhood Mutual is fine with it. But we want to make sure everybody's legal. And just because somebody has their concealed carry doesn't mean they necessarily be a good member of your security team. The Constance Free Church, they have a security conference every year, and Bruce Blatchley, the head of the security there, would tell you, if you're going to be on our security team, your mission is exactly the same as the mission of the church. We're here to make disciples, so your approach to security and safety is the same. It's about making disciples. So I thought it was very wise. The questions we ask: where do we get started? Call your local law enforcement, have them walk through your building. They'll give you some great tips. Doesn't cost you anything. And that way they'll know your facility, they'll know about you. Local fire protection do exactly the same thing. Doesn't cost you anything. Have them walk through your building. You can do an assessment, a big book of checklists. That is this thing. And I don't have any more copies, but if you want a PDF version of this, I can email that to you. Just grab my card out there and send me an email, or write your name on that sheet that's out there. This is arranged by ministry area. So, for example, building and property. There's a bunch of checklists for building and property. There's checklists for children and youth, disasters and emergencies. Tear these out, hand them to the people who are leading those ministries so that they have some skin in the game in helping develop a safety policy. This will help you understand where you need to start, to prioritize, and it'll get people kind of in the risk management mindset. We have given so many of these things away. People usually ask for the PDF. If you send me an email or give me your information, I'd be more than happy to email that to you. Identify, recruit. And that's it. I think I went past my 3 minutes that Tim gave me. Any other parting questions? I asked once, I said, anybody got any questions I can answer? And somebody said, no, Steve, we don't have any questions. You can answer. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention and your really good
Thank you.
Have you had any churches collapse?
Recently, you mean?
Yeah.
Snow load?
Not once there's been a claim today. Yeah, no.
So up in this area, there's been a lot of buildings going down, but not the churches I've heard of. So.
There must be something about building codes in Minnesota, because our agency in Georgia